Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I am your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I'm very, very excited about the guest I'm having on the program today. Before I get there, just a reminder, Mormon Book Reviews for our merch store. Somebody just ordered a hat and a t-shirt last night. Thank you for whoever did that. If you want to support our channel on PayPal and Patreon, please, I'll leave some links. Any contributions can make really are helpful to this channel. It really helps me improve our equipment. And speaking of equipment, folks, so now if you watched Monday's interview with Justin, you probably realized I didn't look so good. Well, I didn't. We just got new lighting and I didn't know what I'd do. And so Anthony set up the lighting. We got a little more state-of-the-art lighting in the studio as a result of the supporters from this channel. So I want to thank you for all that. Now, I'm very excited about this episode because we're going to be talking about Masonry and Mormonism. What role did the Masonry play in influencing Mormonism? And I brought on somebody who, by the way, if you look at that symbol behind, yes, Jason Smith is a Mason, and he's also an expert on Mormonism. And we're going to delve a little bit into that as well. Jason Smith, welcome so much to the program.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve.
So I've been talking to you since last summer, and we actually have a couple things. I'm interested in Mormonism and Masonry, but we also have both have a person in common that we really admire, and that is the person in Pauline Hancock, who founded a church in Independence, Missouri. If we get time today, folks, we're going to talk a little bit about Pauline Hancock's church. If you also want to know more about that church, you can watch my interview with Sandra Tanner, where we talk about it. That was the church the Tanners went to after they left the LDS church. So we'll talk about that. But today you're on, and actually, I'm going to have you back on for another episode too, because we're also going to talk about how you ended up being kind of an anti-Mormon evangelical Christian who's now become more nuanced, progressive Christian, and kind of a friend to Mormonism. And that's a fascinating story as well. But I think the story that's going to be really fascinating today is Freemasonry and Mormonism. I want to read Jason's bio because this will give you some background. Jason has been a Mason since 2012 and is a past worshipful master of Duncan's number 60 and the Oklahoma Lodge of Research. He's also a member of many other Masonic bodies. He has been a student of American religious history, particularly Mormonism, for more than 25 years. He is a graduate student at the Chicago Theological Seminary. For his regular vocation, Jason works in the technology field and lives in Duncan, Oklahoma with his wife, Amanda, and too many dogs. Are we going to have any dogs barking in today's episode?
I make no promises.
Okay, so, wow. Okay, this is very exciting. This is such an interesting topic. And Jason, I kind of want to just hand the floor to you. And I want to let's just start the conversation about the early beginnings of Mormonism and also stuff that was happening in upstate New York at that time, which put Masonry front and center as well. Maybe we'll just start there.
Okay. So most folks are familiar with Joseph Smith's involvement in Masonry, at least the fact that he became a Mason in 1842. Within about 6 weeks after becoming a Mason, he gave the Endowment Ceremony to its first recipients. But many years before that, the Smith family was steeped in Masonry, magic, and mysticism. Joseph Sr. and tried to become a Mason, had some troubles becoming one, was blackballed, but Hiram Smith was a Mason. Both of Joseph Jr.'s grandfathers were Masons. And the William Morgan affair happened in 1826, just a few miles away from where Joseph Smith grew up. And the Morgan affair is infamous in American history because it created the Anti-Masonic Party. And
yeah, that was huge. That was like a huge political party at that time, and it was a very influential movement. And by the way, folks, I meant to bring this up at the beginning. This is leading up to my Summer of Masonry, where we talk about the book Method Infinite, Freemasonry and the Mormon Restoration. And that book is coming out next August. I'm going to leave a link in the description for you to pre-order it. And Jason, we'll talk about, I want to maybe at the end of this episode, we'll talk about, you actually wrote a review of it, so we can talk about that as well. But continue with, okay, the rise of the Anti-Masonic Party was a big deal. This was the talk of the nation.
Yes, this was the result of William Morgan was a stonemason, and he disappeared after it was reported that he was going to publish a expose of Masonic ritual, and he disappeared, was supposedly murdered by Freemasons. There's a lot of mystery and conjecture around that, but he did disappear and was never heard of again. And news of this got around the country, and many saw the Masons as something evil. And in New York State, about 500 lodges were in existence, and only about 100 after the Morgan affair.
Wow.
It was estimated that of about 50,000 Freemasons in the United States before the Morgan affair, about 45,000 of those left Masonry.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a big deal, and it would have been in the soup that Joseph was in. It would have been talked about in the newspapers, in the general store, and
So Joseph wouldn't have even had to have read the book that William Morgan wrote to get a general idea that people would have probably talked about things that was in the book. From my understanding, they were actually doing reenactments of their secret ceremonies in public display. So it was everywhere.
yes, in fact, there were entire newspapers dedicated to anti-Masonry, and Joseph would have heard about it. He would have seen the degrees put on. He would have seen
He would have seen basically all that was going on in these ceremonies was public knowledge. So he would have seen all the how this organization was structured and what goes on in the temple stuff. So that would have been, everybody would have known about that, especially in that area where that was huge, the anti-Masonic stuff.
yes, he would have seen all the secrets, all the handshakes, all the passwords,
Exactly.
all the things that Masons still today believe are secret. We still at least pretend that they are, and Joseph would have known all about it, as well as other Masonic or magic practices that the Smith family encountered, the dowsing, the witching, their practice in cunning magic. They would have been very familiar with a lot of the things that Masons would have also done.
So like with magic and stuff like that, and like the folk magic, was there any Masonic influence on that? Or I mean, were they maybe taking symbols of Masonry and integrating it into folk magic practices and stuff like that?
Yeah, so one thing that Masonry is huge on is symbols. Masonry has lots of symbols that magic users at that time would have used. The Tetragrammaton, the Star of David, the square and compasses. Those things would have been used and were used in parchments that we know the Smith family had.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because they believe these symbols were tied in with like supernatural aspects, so they would then bring power to the practitioner of these things. So they would use Christian symbols and pagan symbols and Masonic symbols, whatever the symbols that they thought might provide them protection or power during their magical endeavors.
Yes, and some people believe that the William Morgan affair might have given rise to some of the passages in the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses about secret combinations.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, I personally feel that that what Joseph was talking about, or what he was doing with the secret combinations of the Book of Mormon, he was referring to a spurious branch of Freemasonry that many Masons and non-Masons believed in at the time. That not only did God teach Masonry to Adam and it passed on down through his posterity, but also that Satan taught a false form of Masonry to Cain and down through Nimrod and others. And that's what Joseph was referring to with the secret combinations.
And that's what's fascinating, because of course in the book of Moses we have Cain referring to himself as Master Mahon,
Right.
which in other words, maybe that was the original word and it got corrupted as where things went down. So in other words, it's obvious. It sounds very much like Master Mason. You would agree?
Yes.
And you think that that's probably a connection to Freemasonry that made its way into the Book of Moses?
Yes, I think that not only is the Book of Mormon influenced by Freemasonry, but I think that the Joseph's translation of the Bible in the Book of Moses was as well.
So I like this. This was really intriguing to me, because we talked about this the other day. I had never thought of it this way, but that is true, that there was this idea that there was true Freemasonry. And even some would say, like, well, George Washington, he was a godly man. He practiced true Freemasonry and then he got corrupted or whatever. I've heard that story before. But then there was this parallel throughout history from the very beginning of time, where you had pure Mormonism, and then you had this spurious form of Mormonism, of Masonry, and that perhaps the spurious Masonry also kind of corrupted the pure Masonry, maybe caused some cross-pollination to occur. And that, so like when Martin Harris referred to the book of, let's get back to the Book of Mormon. Martin Harris referred to the Book of Mormon as a anti-Masonic Bible, but yet actually you had told me that many Masons would have read the Book of Mormon and said, actually, this is a pro-Masonic Bible.
Yes, well, the Book of Mormon talks about many of the things that Masons at that time would have purported. The ideas about government, about freedom, would have resonated with Masons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, as I stated earlier, I think that the secret combinations, most Masons that were versed in books such as George Oliver's Antiquities of Freemasonry, which was very popular, that they would have seen that as these are the bad guys. They're not good Masons, they're bad Masons. And they would have seen that in the Nephites, they would have seen the good Masons.
And then the Gadianton robbers.
Building temples, building.
Okay, so they're building temples, they're doing temple works, things that would be recognizable to a Mason, but then you have this spurious form of Masonry, secret combinations, the Gadianton robbers would be a parallel organization that was spurious. Yes,
the spurious Masons were seen by Masons at the time, sort of like we would see the Illuminati now. That there was a master plan to take over the government and uproot religion as we know it. And that was the spurious Masons.
And by this time, just I'm curious, because Adam Weishaupt founded the Bavarian Lodge of the Illuminati in 1776. Was this theory about the Illuminati also something that was talked about at this time?
Very much so.
Okay.
And after William Morgan, other non-Masons saw Freemasonry in general as being tied to the Illuminati.
Okay. Now I do remember. Now I don't know if this is a spurious story or not, but it just hit me. I remember I was reading some anti-Masonic literature like when I was in high school, and supposedly there was a speech given by George Washington in which he condemned the Illuminati. Is that an apocryphal story, or did George Washington go on record saying this is not true Masonry, and then went after the Illuminati? Or have you ever heard that story before?
I haven't heard that story.
Yeah, so apparently he gave a speech condemning the Illuminati. I don't know if it was a real document or not, but I just found that fascinating, because that would be the idea that, well, our founding fathers were true Masons, they were good men, and then you had this European form of Masonry, French, coming, or Bavarian, coming over and corrupting the Masonry in America. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about, this is another question I have for you, and we talked about this the other day. Some people have speculated that the name Mormon might have been influenced by the name William Morgan. Do you think there's any connection there?
I think that's a stretch.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. I even feel the same way about the Comoros Island and Moroni, the capital. I don't think that's a real bullseye there. So since we're talking about early Mormonism, and one of the things we talked about was the idea of golden plates. This is a very Masonic story. So talk about the tie of buried plates in with Freemasonry.
So I've got a slide to share. Let me
Let's
do
do it.
that.
Let's see here. We'll do a view here. We're going to do some screen sharing. I just love this stuff. I'm really enjoying this, Jason, and I can't wait for that thing to pop on, and we'll do some more talking. Yeah, so just real quick while he's working on that. Okay, here we go. Okay. Oh, this is good. Okay, the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Let's talk about this.
So there's a story in Masonry that is told in many different ways and different degrees, but basically a story of an ancient prophet or patriarch that buries something of great treasure, great value, usually with mysterious teachings or hidden teachings, buries it underground. It's found later by later Masons, and that truth is restored. Mm-hmm. And one of the most common versions is the story of Enoch, the patriarch and prophet of the Old Testament. And Enoch buried a gold plate under 9 arches in the earth, and he was able to visit the site once per year, just like Joseph could visit the Hill Cumorah site once per year. Enoch buried a plate of gold that was buried under a keystone, and he rested it on a pillar of alabaster. And this parallels the Book of Mormon story in that, an ancient prophet buries a treasure. Smith was able to visit the site once per year. There's plates of gold instead of a plate of gold, found under a keystone, and it's resting on 3 pillars when he found it. Also, Joseph Smith Sr. said that the elements of Masonry, the square and compass and other symbols, were found on the plates themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think it's pretty convincing that Joseph was inspired by the Masonic tradition when he came up with the story of the Book of Mormon and the coming forth of it.
Yeah, so it kind of provides a template that he can use in talking about a coming forth of a sacred ancient record. It appears to parallel the Enochian tale told in Masonry.
Yes.
All right, cool. So why don't you want to show any more slides while we're still have it open, or do you want to just
let me show
oh yeah, okay. Yes.
Yeah, this is
there we go.
So this is the 2 kinds of Masonry that George Oliver talks about in his book Antiquities of Freemasonry. And basically God taught Masonry to Adam, and Cain taught Masonry to Cain, spurious Masonry to Cain. And both of these are supposedly still around in the time of Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm. And it's passed down.
Yeah.
And it's okay. So it's a parallel story. It seems like Satan is kind of in the process at the very beginning. He's kind of hatching a parallel plan to God's.
Yes, and if you look in the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses, there are secrets, there are oaths, there's penalties. It even talks about the Gadianton robbers, wearing sheepskin across their loins, as aprons.
No, interesting, man. Yeah, fascinating stuff, dude. Yeah, so there are some parallels there, and people I think caught on to some of that early on as well. Obviously saw that, and it was fascinating to do that. And so, one of the things is there anything that we want to talk about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon vis-a-vis it's the influence that Masonry had on the Book of Mormon as well as early Mormonism, like 1827 to 1830.
No, I would encourage people to get the Method Infinite book though, because they have an entire chapter on that period before the Book of Mormon.
Excellent. So now let's move into maybe as we move further into church history a little bit. So where's our next place we want to go where we see an influence of Freemasonry on Mormonism?
Well, I would point to the Kirtland era and the formation of the high priesthood.
Okay.
I think that and the Book of Abraham kind of plays into this too. Joseph, when he translates the Book of Abraham, he learns about this order of high priesthood. And it has grand keywords and grips. The fact that the high priesthood is the Melchizedek priesthood is interesting because he calls it the order of high priesthood, and there's actually a degree in Royal Arch Masonry called the order of high priesthood.
Oh, wow.
And the story of that degree is the prophet Abraham going to visit Melchizedek and paying homage to him. And I think it's interesting that the Joseph's order of the high priesthood is the Melchizedek priesthood.
Fascinating. And let's talk a little bit. Also, Enoch makes his appearance in these pages as well in the I believe the Book of Moses, where he's not only is he translated, but an entire city is translated. Is there any parallel of this kind of story in Freemasonry?
No, but Enoch does play a large role in Masonic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Not only the story of him bearing the golden plate, but he's seen as one that was very familiar with the mysteries of God.
Yeah. So it sounds like the Enoch plays a major. It's a fascinating how Enoch is treated, and of course at this time you had the coming forth of the Book of Enoch at this time, right, where there was a translation of it. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, there have been several books of Enoch that have come out over the years, but Masons have not really jumped on any of those as being true or historical.
Okay.
But at the time of Joseph Smith, books like George Oliver's book told very fanciful tales of this continuous thread of Masonry, taught to Adam on down through his posterity, through the flood, through to Moses and even to Jesus. And but otherwise, the Book of Enoch really doesn't play a part in Masonic tradition.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious about that. So one of the things that we talked about, how not only do we see like the priesthood structure that seems to have some parallels and influences with Freemasonry, but we also have another secret combination, if you will, another secret society called the Danites. And maybe there's some parallels between the practices of the Danites and Masonry.
There certainly are. The Danites were formed and initiated into the order through a series of degrees or stages, as Masons are. There was an oath of secrecy and there were grips and signs to distinguish between non-members of the group and to be able to recognize one another. There was pretty strong penalties involved. And I think the Danites may have taken them more seriously than the Masons do. But
I actually want to get that because early on you talked about we don't know, William Morgan disappeared. Do you personally believe that he was murdered by Masons? Was this something Masons would have done then in the 1820s, or do you think that may not be as clear cut as people think it is?
Well, I think that there's a good chance that they did kidnap him, and they may have gotten to the point where they didn't know what to do with him. There was talk that possibly he went to Canada, got paid off, but it's entirely possible at that time that Freemasons may have killed him. But generally throughout the history of Freemasonry, the the oaths and penalties are considered to be more allegorical, and not physically binding, that those things would happen to someone if they divulge the secrets.
Okay, very interesting. And would they have looked at it as allegorical at the time, the Masons, when they took these oaths?
Most would.
Interesting. Interesting. So in other words, a lot of the things that people were saying about the Masons was misunderstood because they were taking things very literally, where a lot of it was meant to be taken allegorically.
Yes.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so we have the Danites, who have this secret society that are kind of seem to be modeled after the structure of Freemasonry. And you mentioned it seems like they kind of take those oaths more literally.
Yeah. There's a story that that Joseph Smith himself almost was attacked in the night because he wasn't familiar enough with the signs to distinguish himself.
Got it. So one of the things what is so fascinating, of course, is what we see is within Mormonism, a lot of people believe that the temple ceremonies, the endowment ceremony, was highly influenced by Freemasonry. Before we move to the Nauvoo period, was there anything else that you wanted covered before we got there?
No, let's move on to Nauvoo.
Okay, so so we're at Nauvoo, and Joseph Smith, well, let's just talk about when Freemasonry and Mormonism start influencing each other, or when they start, that whole thing starts happening. Like, what would have caused Mormons to become Masons at that time?
So in December of 1841, the Nauvoo Lodge was organized, and they already had a petition from Joseph Smith the next day to join the lodge. He was initiated in March, on March 16th of 1842, and he took his first degree that day. The next day he took his next 2 degrees, which is not very common. Usually there's at least a month or more between the degrees. The same day that he became a Master Mason, he formed the Relief Society and put Emma as the head of it. And there's some parallels in the Relief Society as well. They met in the lodge room, which was the upper story of the red brick store, Joseph's red brick store. There was an importance placed on secrecy and discretion. Joseph was famous for telling the women that they should be as skilled at masonry as to keep a secret. The Relief Society was run very much like a Masonic lodge. Things were done in a very orderly way and by democratic vote. There was a very Masonic style process for petitioning and election of new members. They had to be voted unanimously to join. So there's a lot of parallels there with Relief Society. And then in May, we're going to talk about the endowment ceremony.
Well, yeah, but before we do that, did Freemasonry at that time have a women's auxiliary, like Joseph had set up, if you will, kind of almost like a women's auxiliary of Masonry?
So yes, there were women's groups. The Royal Arch degrees, which is a kind of an advanced set of degrees beyond the basic craft lodge. They had the Heroines of Jericho. There were other groups other groups of Masons that had kind of women's auxiliaries. They weren't members of the men's group, but they had their own separate degrees that they went through. So there were groups of women that in Masonic bodies, but I think Joseph possibly already had in mind that he wanted to include women into Masonry when he started the Relief Society.
Oh, okay, like more fully integrated then.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Now, I do have to go back to how was it that Joseph was able to get his degrees so quickly? Was it, were these outside Masons that were bestowing this to him, or were these Mormons who were Masons before him that let him climb up the ladder so quickly?
So he was what is called made a Mason at sight. And this was done by the Grand Master who had dispensation to do that. In Masonry, the Grand Master can do pretty much anything the Grand Master wants to do. They can waive rules that generally apply to most people, but generally when you become a Mason, you're initiated, and there's a waiting period between your next 2 degrees for you to learn the passwords, the grips, and kind of a catechism structure of questions and answers you have to memorize. And Joseph, all that was waived for him. And I think a large part of that was the fact that he was kind of a big deal in Nauvoo. And I think that the Grand Master wanted to please him.
Okay, that's interesting. So there's some political stuff going on here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting backstory. The Grand Master had political ambitions, and he knew that there were a growing number of Mormons, and he wanted to make the Mormons happy for political reasons.
Now, before we get into the endowment and its influence, let's just tell the audience that at its peak, the Mormon Masonic Lodge was the largest. Actually, there were more Mormons in Masonry than the rest of the state of Illinois combined. Is that correct?
Yes, one author puts it about 6 times as many Masons as in all the other lodges in the state combined.
So so were the other Masonic lodges concerned about that?
Very much so.
Okay, so this is actually another underlying tension, if you will, with the Gentile world and the saints.
Yeah, there were a lot of irregularities in the not just Nauvoo Lodge, but there were other Mormon lodges in the area that were doing things like they were meeting every day of the week, sometimes putting men through the degrees in every meeting. At this time, most lodges would meet once a month or possibly twice a month, and they would maybe bring 1 or 2 men into the fraternity at that meeting. But these lodges were meeting every day of the week, and
so it was meant to be more deliberative, and apparently they were just putting it on. They were putting that thing on steroids and just getting people initiated every day.
Yes, it seems that Hiram Smith was the master for a time of the Nauvoo Lodge, and I think that the plan was to make every male Mormon a Mason.
Fascinating. So that's that, and we're going to get to maybe later about the Freemasonry, the role it plays also, or somewhat in the martyrdom. But you wanted to talk about the endowment ceremony. So of course, folks, we're going to be respectful here on this program, but perhaps you could just talk about some parallels between Freemasonry and ceremonies and endowment ceremonies.
So there have been Mormon apologists and historians that tend to downplay the fact that Joseph uses some of the same elements of Masonic ritual in the endowment, some of the same handshakes or grips, some of the same signs, or the way that your arms are placed, to make different signs. There are a lot of other similarities too, but there are some apologists that downplay these and say that, well, either they're just coincidental, that throughout history people have made this similar sign, with their arms, and or they say that that Joseph saw elements of Freemasonry that were a lost temple endowment, and he was going to restore that in the Mormon temple endowment.
Okay, fascinating. And just to get back to one thing that we talked about the other day is that Don Bradley wrote the book The Lost 116 Pages, and he believes that what we would consider Nauvoo era Temple Endowment Ceremonies were actually already in the original lost 116 pages. Since we're talking about the endowment ceremony, what's your thoughts on that theory?
Well, it's possible. I think that Joseph was familiar enough with Masonry at that early stage that that he could have had some of those things in mind.
Yeah, so that's kind of a naturalistic explanation that perhaps those, because he had knowledge of the Masonic temple rituals, that they could have been in the lost 116 pages, which I find is very fascinating stuff. Of course, we have the square and the compass in here as well, because apparently Joseph Sr. said that was included in there, as you alluded to earlier. So either way, the endowment ceremony and the Masonic temple ceremonies weren't just there in Nauvoo. They were kind of there from the beginning.
I think that early on Joseph had an idea of the endowment ceremony, but I think that as he went along, like in the Kirtland era, in the book of Abraham, I think that he started to piece together more and more of it as it went along, and whether that is line upon line and precept upon precept of inspiration, or whether he just saw some things that he thought worked together well. I think that he's always been pragmatic about picking up new aspects of the endowment and other things too.
Okay, interesting. So all right, so let's talk a little bit about Nauvoo era. This is kind of where the convergence happens with the endowment ceremony. By the way, do you have any slides any more slides you'd like to share while we're talking about this topic?
I do. I have a couple of slides about
let's pull those up.
Endowment ceremony.
Very good. Get ready here. Do your thing. I'll do my thing. And this is very interesting stuff, dude. I've always been fascinated by this topic, and it dawned on me I hadn't really been talking about it, and this channel has been around for a little over a year. So I'm glad we're having this conversation to address this. So that's kind of cool. But by the way, folks, I saw Jason, as you're pulling this up, I saw Jason give a presentation to some Masons, and that was the background he had. And when I talked to him the other day, I'm like, okay, Jason, that's the background you got to have for this interview. So I'm glad you did that. Thanks. All right. So here is a parallel. So apparently it looks like a parallel between the Masonry and Mormon endowment. Please proceed.
Yes. So both Masonic ritual and the Mormon endowment have obligations that are taken at an altar. There's a portrayal of a quasi-biblical story in Masonic ritual. There's a character called Hiram Abiff that in the Master Mason degree, there's a story told about him he's mentioned in the Bible, but there's more in the Masonic ritual that you don't get from the Bible, just like the story of Adam and Eve and in the garden. There's a test of fidelity. There's this theme of upward ascent that you're moving upward and gaining more knowledge. There are signs and tokens, keywords, oaths of secrecy. There are penalties, at least in the older endowment ritual. There are penalties. In Masonry, there are three basic degrees: entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason. And there's also a fourth degree in the time of Joseph. There would have been a fourth degree called the Royal Arch degree that would have been considered part of regular Masonry too. And there, as we know, there's 4 stages of the endowment ceremony. There's this promise of further light and knowledge in both Masonry and in the endowment ceremony. And then passing of veils. This is something in Royal Arch Masonry that is very important. The square and compass is plainly obvious in the temple endowment and on the garments. 3 ceremonial knocks. There's several instances of the number 3 in Masonry and in the endowment. 5 points of fellowship, which is no longer in the endowment now. This idea of interrogation is a teaching method. What is this? Has it a name? Question and answer, that's very important. The divestiture of worldly clothing. in a Masonic degree. The candidate is divested of his worldly apparel and given new clothes to wear for the degree, just as in the temple endowment. Clothing is worn in a special manner. This is something that's in both. And then also the symbolic apron. In Masonry, the Masonic apron, or white lambskin apron, is what most people associate when they see that. They know it's a Masonic symbol. And then the Mormon Temple Endowment, of course, they wear a green apron.
Fascinating. Could that so is it possible that when they're talking about using white aprons, the Gaddites and robbers, that maybe that was a reference to that, that the Masonry, could that be a parallel there?
I think it was a parallel to the Spurious Masons, because it talks about the Gaddites and robbers actually having red aprons that were dyed in the blood.
Oh, they were white, but they were dyed in blood. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, got it. Wow, interesting stuff, dude. So there's definitely you have been able to identify some parallels. Here, let me ask you a question. So how much research has gone, and I want to talk about the Council of 50 and a few other things as well, and post-Nauvoo Mormonism, but I'm just curious, like, how much like time have you spent, because you've been studying Mormonism for basically as long as I have. How long were you studying Freemasonry and Mormonism during this period of time? Was this something you picked up when you became a Mason, or were you also studying it before you became a Mason?
I studied it some before I became a Mason, but some of the things didn't quite connect with me the same way until I became a Mason.
Okay, so you became a Mason, and you also had a lot of knowledge of Mormonism, and so you're able to identify some of these parallels. I'm really curious what Benjamin Schaefer of Christ Branch thinks about this, because he's both a practicing a Mormon of a sect that's not based in Salt Lake City. It's a fundamentalist group, but he's also a Mormon. So I'm curious to get some feedback from him on this one. So let's talk about a little bit about we've talked about the Endowment Ceremony. I want us to talk a little bit about also the Council of 50, kind of like some parallels between Masonry and the Council of 50. And then I want us to talk about maybe about post-Nauvoo Mormonism influence.
Okay, so the Council of 50, is a theocratic and political organization that Joseph thought would be the basis for God's kingdom on the earth. Members were required to swear an oath of secrecy, like Masonry. All decisions required unanimous consent. They began meeting in the lodge room, and Joseph was ordained as king by the Council of 50, and one of the in the Royal Arch line of Masonry, there's this idea of a prophet, priest, and king, the three of those that preside over a Royal Arch chapter of Masons. And Joseph, I think, saw himself as all three of those things: prophet, priest, and king.
Fascinating. Yeah, I was going to ask you about him being crowned king, if there was a parallel there. So thank you for bringing that up. Anything else about the Council of 50 that you want to talk about, the influence of Masonry?
Well, I think that Joseph's presidential ambitions, and I think also coincided with, there was a move among Masons nationally at the time, those that were trying to build back from since the William Morgan affair, that they would institute a national Grand Lodge. All the states had their own Grand Lodges, but some wanted to nationalize and form a national Grand Lodge. And I think that some saw that that Joseph, having as much power as he did with all the Masons that he had in Illinois, might be a good fit for that.
Oh, fascinating. Wow, yeah, I never heard that before. I do have a quick question for you. In the Council of 50, it wasn't all Mormons. there were some Gentiles in the Council of 50. Were those Gentiles also Masons?
Not everyone, but
Okay.
most of the Mormons that were involved were.
Okay.
And it was almost entirely Mormons and Masons, at least in the beginning of the Council of 50.
Okay, fascinating, interesting. Okay, so anything else you want to talk about the Nauvoo period?
Well, we can't not talk about the death of Joseph.
Oh, okay, yeah, and that's
And
actually the most important thing, because this is the thing. Okay, there were apparently Masons that were in the mob, and Joseph Smith's last words. Talk about that.
well, why don't you tell me what they were?
Oh, I'm blanking. I was just thinking about the what was the a widow's that has to do with the widow's son or something like that. I forget. I don't know why I'm blanking on that, because I just mentioned it to somebody the other day. So Joseph's basically, it's a plea for help from fellow Masons, as he's at the window, and then they believe that he was beginning to recite, "Oh Lord, my God," and
Yes.
and then he was wasn't able to finish it, but they
I'm
believe
not
he was.
allowed to say that, by the way. That's why.
Oh, that's fascinating to me. Okay, thank you for well, is it okay that I said it?
Well, it's your show.
Am I gonna get in trouble by the Masons, man?
No, I'll put in a word for you.
Please do, man. I need all the help I can get. So, well, okay, so that's fascinating to me. So he obviously probably knew that there were Masons in the mob, and he's doing the distress call to other fellow Masons that they would recognize that he's one of us, but that didn't seem to help his cause.
No, it did not.
And why do you think that is?
Well, at this point, the Nauvoo Lodge and the other Mormon lodges had their charters or dispensations revoked by the Grand Lodge. And
Okay.
so they were not seen as regular Masons. They were seen as what are called clandestine Masons.
Okay. And so if anything, they probably have more contempt for them than a non-member.
Many of them would, yes.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So is there, Freemasonry, of course, folks, from the very beginning of this country, especially going into the Masonic period, anti-Masonic period, has played a major role in conspiracy theories all the way to these modern days, right? So Dan Brown's hit on it, and it's real popular in American literature. Were there people at the time that were thinking that it was a Masonic conspiracy, or have people speculated that Joseph's assassination was a Masonic conspiracy theory?
People have speculated that then and now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there may be something to that at least there was some resentment among the Masons in the mob. But I think that Joseph had probably other reasons that people were upset with him as well. So
Yeah, so it was a combination of all sorts of different factors.
yeah.
So now, was there anything else about the martyrdom you wanted to cover?
No.
Okay, so I guess we could talk about now a little bit about the influence of post Nauvoo, the Masonic influences. Now, this is the thing: is like you had one of the apostles talking about how Joseph was restoring pure Masonry or true Masonry, and so it was like Joseph was restoring true Christianity. He was attempting to restore true Masonry. Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've got a few slides on that.
Please, let's do that. I like it. Okay, so I'll just get her set up. So yeah, so then the other thing too, folks, it wasn't until, well, we're going to talk about how it wasn't until the mid 80s that finally the Mormons and the Masons finally buried the hatchet. So this is a long simmering feud. Fascinating stuff. Okay.
So,
oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah, so this is one of the more famous quotes by Heber C. Kimball. This was shortly after the Endowment Ceremony was introduced, and he wrote, "I wish you were here so as to see and hear for yourself. We received some precious things through the prophet on the priesthood that would cause your soul to rejoice. I cannot give them to you on paper, for they are not to be written. So you must come and get them for yourself. There is a similarity of priesthood and Masonry. Brother Joseph says Masonry was taken from priesthood, but has become degenerated, but many things are perfect.
Interesting.
And here's another quote, which you're alluding to,
Yeah.
from Heber C. Kimball. We have the true Masonry. The Masonry of today is received from the apostasy which took place in the days of Solomon and David. They have now and then a thing that is correct, but we have the real thing.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's so fascinating. So there was an apostasy within Masonry, and there needed to be a restoration. Fascinating.
Yeah. And one more quote by Apostle Rutger Clausen. The Masons admitted some keys of knowledge appertaining to Masonry were lost. Joseph inquired of the Lord concerning the matter, and he revealed to the prophet true Masonry, as we have it in our temples.
Wow. Fascinating. So let me ask you, so as the history, so I was talking to a pretty well-known person, and we were talking about how, early Freemasonry and the Freemasonry of the time and the Mormonism of the time had some similarities in their ceremonies, but it's harder now to find those parallels because both of them have kind of both diverged in different directions. So the parallels aren't as obvious now as they would have been then. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I think that may be a fair assessment. The first time I presented about this subject to the Oklahoma Lodge of Research, I had a brother Mason who's recently left the church, and it is a relatively young guy. He's mid-20s, and he said, several of the things you mentioned, aren't in the ceremony anymore, but I know they used to be. He said, but when I became a Mason, I noticed right away all the similarities that I had missed as an endowed temple member. And so I think that even today the similarities are there. I saw a post by Jonathan Streeter not too long ago that he talked about the penalties still being in the temple ceremony, and he makes a pretty good case for that. I'd encourage you to go check that out. It's only about 8 or 10 minutes long, but the motions you make with your hands and stuff in the penalties in the endowment ceremony, you still put your hands in those same formations.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, so I find this presentation you gave tonight to be very fascinating. Was there anything else you wanted to cover about Freemasonry that we didn't touch on yet?
No, I don't think so. I would leave you with one last quote that
You want to put it on the screen if you want.
Yeah, I'll put it on the screen. I've got too many windows open.
All good. So that's fine. Hey, this is the way it goes. That's fine. And then what we're going to talk about is we're going to briefly talk a little bit about I want to talk to Jason about Jason's story too. So, okay, what does this say here? There's some good images there, man. You got some cool stuff.
I'm on the wrong PowerPoint.
Oh,
Sorry.
It's all right. Okay. It's all good. That happens. Did you want to summarize the quote? Or you think you can find it real quick?
I can find it real quick.
Okay, cool. So while he's doing that, again, folks, I'm going to leave a link in the description for Method Infinite for pre-orders. I'm very excited about that. It's been a long time. When I was a kid in the 90s, man, I was so fascinated by Freemasonry. So I read a lot of stuff about that and the Illuminati. That was my wheelhouse. All right. What does Brigham Young have to say here? Yeah,
so this is something that's still, I believe, still said in the beginning of the endowment. Your endowment is to receive all those ordinances in the house of the Lord, which are necessary for you after you have departed this life, to enable you to walk into the presence of the Father, passing the angels who stand as sentinels, being enabled to give them the key words, the signs, and tokens pertaining to the holy priesthood, and gain your eternal exaltation. So Brigham Young still tells us today in the endowment that there's something there for Masonry, that with the key words, signs, and tokens.
Yeah. Very interesting stuff. Yep. So, well, I want to thank you so much for talking about Masonry, but before I let you go, I actually want to actually talk about one more thing about Freemasonry, and this is so interesting. And this is why I want to have Jason to come back up, because he has a fascinating story about how he was basically an anti-Mormon activist and researcher, and then he kind of changed and kind of had a change of heart about the Restoration. But you also were, as a kid, much like me, anti-Masonic. You were raised Southern Baptist, but your father was a Mason. Is that correct?
That's correct. He was.
Why don't you just tell us a little bit about that story?
So back in the 90s, the Southern Baptist Convention, which I was raised in, they had a controversy about Freemasonry, and some members of the denomination wanted the convention to take a firm stance against it. And there was actually a year-long study that was developed. There was a task force committed to it, and the leader of the task force that actually did the study ended up becoming a Mason himself, and as he studied Masonry. But yeah, I was very much against Masonry when I was a teenager and into my early 20s. My father was very patient with me. He always told me, well, someday, if you think about it, want to learn more, we'll get you a petition. And it was when the day that he got his 50-year pin as being in the fraternity for 50 years, that's the day that I got my petition.
Wow.
And so
what made you change your mind from going from anti-Mason to a Mason?
Well, a more liberal view of things.
Okay.
And actually just being able to see through a lot of the arguments that were put forth against Masonry. They were pretty weak arguments.
Yeah. Well, and that's fascinating, because I tell people, I know a lot about Mormonism. And I hear a lot of people who have all these great opinions about Mormonism, and they don't know anything about Mormonism. They start some evangelicals start telling me what they know about Mormonism. No, you don't understand. You really haven't done the research. You really haven't read the things. And I found the same thing with Freemasonry. If anything, if you look at the histories, there's another history of Freemasonry, and that was Freemasonry was very instrumental in overthrowing despots in Europe. The idea of ideas of liberty and individual freedom. All these ideas would become American ideals. So in one sense, it was, and part of the reason why it was banned by the Catholic Church, or you couldn't allow it, because it undermined, the institutional authority in Europe. At least it was viewed as a threat to the institutional authority, because it gave a place for regular folk to have some power and influence in the society as well, that didn't afford them that at that time.
That's right. And Freemasonry is still looked down upon by some governments of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Masons had their own insignia in the Holocaust.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the Nazis and
the
Franco in
Spain.
Spain.
A red triangle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had like a friend, Franco, the president of Spain. He was so obsessed with Mormonism, he actually had like a whole built like room that was like a replica of like a Masonic, I don't know, hall or something, which I've always found fascinating. So he was fascinated by it, but banned it, just like Hitler did. They viewed it as a threat as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. And so your father, before he passes away, you become so you were able to do that before he passed away. What did that mean to your father?
I think it meant the world to him, and it did to me as well. He passed away not many months after I became a Master Mason.
So that's fascinating.
But we were able to sit and lodge together a few times, and it's quite a thing when your father becomes your brother. It's a very special bond.
Oh, what a great story. I'm glad that it came full circle there, and your father was able to see that. That's some of the regrets that a lot of people that their parents didn't get to see. You become do that full circle and circle back. Just for a few minutes here, I just want us to talk briefly about another favorite subject of ours, and that is Pauline Hancock, who was the only female founder of a Restorationist church, a Book of Mormon believing church, Bible believing, Jesus believing, Book of Mormon believing church. And that was the church that Gerald and Sandra joined after they left the LDS church. What made you so interested in that subject?
Well, one reason that I became interested in Pauline Hancock is I was raised by a strong woman, and was always taught to respect women. And I would correct you on one thing. I think that she was the first woman to become a leader and found a Mormon church, but I don't think she's the only one.
Okay, well, thank you. Do you know who? I mean, because yeah, was there another one that you can name for me?
Yes, if you hadn't asked me, I could. If you look at Steve Shields' book.
Oh yeah. Okay, then we'll talk.
He lists about 500 and something
Expressions and
groups,
sects and stuff. Yeah, yeah.
But
okay.
I certainly think that she was the first.
She was definitely the first, no doubt about it. Yeah. So tell me. So you got interested in her because there's just a strong woman, and it's an interesting story.
It is. Pauline was raised in the RLDS Church, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and like a lot of people in the mid 1920s, she becomes dissatisfied with the direction the church is headed. This was something called the Supreme Directional Control controversy, where the Frederick M. Smith, the president of the RLDS Church, declared that he should have supreme directional control of the church. And a lot of people left, including Pauline and her husband. They spent some time in a protest group that was just called the Protest Group, and members that still wanted to be faithful to the RLDS faith but couldn't stomach Frederick M. Smith's leadership. And then she joins the Temple Lot Church.
And at this time, the Temple Lot and the RLDS recognized each other's baptisms, correct?
Yes. Well,
because Otto Fetting came in and changed it, but
the Temple Lot Church recognized the RLDS baptisms.
Oh, okay, not the other way around.
After about a third of the church left the RLDS church at that time, they didn't know there. Well, I don't know if anybody left the Temple Lot Church to go to the RLDS church, really.
Yeah, probably. Okay, probably not. Yeah, so I don't know.
But yeah, they went and joined the Temple Lot Church, and there was a elder there called Samuel Wood that began teaching a oneness theology, a one Godhead theology, and Pauline liked it. She sponsored his book that he published, and he was excommunicated from the Temple Lot Church, and Pauline and her husband left with him. A few years later, she spent her time in the antiques business and did that for several years. But I think around 1946, she started meeting in members' homes, having Book of Mormon and Bible studies, and she eventually started her own church. And as you said, the Tanners were involved in her church. She baptized the Tanners, and I think if you read Ron Huggins' book, The Lighthouse, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, I think that Pauline meant a lot to the Tanners for a long time.
Absolutely, yeah.
She passed away in the early '60s, and even after the Tanners stopped believing in the Book of Mormon, I think that Pauline and her church members still felt close to the Tanners.
Yeah, there was a kinship there. Yep. And it's a fascinating story, folks, because, people don't realize this. Gerald Tanner was not through with the Restoration when they left the LDS Church. He was going to Independence, Missouri. He was going to try to start up David Whitmore's old church. Yeah. And then he found themselves walking through the doors of Pauline's church. And in one sense, history was changed, by this little church and this female founder of a Restorationist branch that really kind of started things in a certain direction, which changed the course of Mormon history in many ways.
And it's very likely that if Gerald had not been involved with Pauline Hancock, the Tanners wouldn't be the Tanners,
right?
Because It was at a meeting in where Gerald was playing Pauline sermons and invited some people to come. That Sandra's grandmother had drug her along to this meeting, and that's where she met Gerald.
That's right. So that everything was put into motion there in this remarkable story. In my interview with Sandra Tanner, I spent a lot of time talking about Pauline Hancock at her church. I deliberately did that because no evangelicals are interested in hearing that story. But that, to me, of course, I'm the evangelical that is. And I think it's important that we document these stories. And I want to thank you for documenting some stories. I want to thank you for writing about Pauline Hancock. I want to thank you for having a change of heart on Mormonism, in that it's enabled you to actually kind of be more objective in your study of Mormonism. And in many ways, and we're going to have you back because I want to talk about how Mormonism even impacted you and your faith by something that an apostle said. And I find that to be a fascinating story. And so you went basically from fundamentalist, anti-Mormon to basically more nuanced, progressive, restorationist, right? Well, restoration as well, because you're disciples of Christ, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the Restorationist Church that affiliated with, that would have been something that Sidney Rigdon would have been baptized into before he went into the LDS Church. Jason, I really appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me.
And I want to thank you because I think the work that you do is so awesome. And you had told me that you don't normally do interviews, but you felt comfortable coming on my program. And I'm so glad you did, because I think your story and your story is fascinating to me. And I've been wanting to get you on since last summer. So thanks for giving me the privilege of coming on my program.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Steve.
So was there anything else that you wanted to talk about before I let you go today?
No, I think we covered it.
All right. So folks, this was awesome. Freemasonry, Mormonism, it's all good. So I just want to remind you to don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for when a new episode comes out. Also, I want to thank all my contributors who support the channel via PayPal and Patreon. I would ask you would consider giving a donation. There are many, many podcasts that have hundreds, if not thousands, of donors. You know, and that's great. I'm glad they're being supported. But if you have extra money that you could toss to a little guy like me, that'd be greatly appreciated as well. Also, just remember, Mormon Book Reviews is our merch store. You can help support the channel by buying products as well. And just don't forget that we're on all the major podcasts. About a quarter of my audience now does download episodes. That's really growing fast. We're available on all the major platforms. You all have yourself.
Steve, I got one more thing.
Oh, yeah, let's talk. Okay. Bonus.
Method Infinite coming out August 9th,
yes.
2022.
Yes. And link in the description. I'll have that in there.
It's a groundbreaking work.
And you've read it.
Copy.
And you actually wrote a review of it for the journal. And I'm excited. When is that review going to be published?
The journal comes out in September, right before the meeting.
Okay, so the book will be out, but that's fine. You know, we will have your book, your review, and I'm looking forward to reading the book and then reading your review and see if you got it right. All right, dude, thanks for reminding me about that. And everybody, you have yourself a great day and be well, and try to stay cool this summer because it's hot in Florida and just about everywhere else.